From the beginning, long before the name Canada was ever spoken, this vast northern land was alive with stories, voices, and traditions. Thousands of years before European explorers set foot upon its shores, indigenous peoples thrived across the continent. They lived in harmony with the rivers, forests, and plains, each nation developing its own language, governance, and spiritual connection to the land. The Haudenosaunee built confederacies based on diplomacy and shared power. The Cree and Dene followed caribou across the tundra. The Inuit navigated frozen seas under skies of endless night. On the Pacific coast, the Haida carved monumental totems to honor their ancestors, while in the Great Plains, the Blackfoot followed the buffalo, whose life and death sustained their own. For thousands of years, these peoples traded, negotiated, and sometimes fought, but their world was balanced, their societies resilient. What would later be called Canada was not empty land waiting to be discovered. It was already a vast network of civilizations. Then, in the late 10th century, the first Europeans appeared. Norse sailors from Greenland, led by Leif Erikson, reached the coasts of Newfoundland. Their settlement at Elance Aux Meadows was brief, but it marked the first contact between two worlds that would one day reshape each other. The Norse left little trace, and for nearly 500 years, the indigenous peoples continued their lives undisturbed. In 1497, John Cabot, sailing under the English flag, landed on the Atlantic coast, claiming it for England. A few years later, French explorers began their own ventures. Jacques Cartier's expeditions of the 1,530s brought him up the St. Lawrence River, where he encountered the St. Lawrence Iroquoians at Stadacona and Hochelaga communities near what we now call Quebec City and Montreal. Cartier claimed the territory for France and named it Canada, borrowing the word from the Iroquoian Kanata, meaning village or settlement. Though Cartier's voyages opened the door, it was Samuel de Champlain who truly laid the foundations of New France in the early 1600. He established Quebec City in 1608, not as a conquest, but as a partnership. Champlain relied on alliances with indigenous nations, especially the Huron, when had to survive, trade, and defend the colony. The fur trade became the lifeblood of early Canada, linking indigenous hunters and trappers to European merchants. Beaver pelts, prized for their role in making fashionable hats, became a currency of empire, as French settlers known as habitants spread along the St. Lawrence they built farms, missions, and trading posts. Jesuit missionaries, driven by faith, sought to convert indigenous peoples to Christianity, often with mixed results. Their writings would later become invaluable records of early Canadian life, though they also reflected the biases and ambitions of their age. Meanwhile, England was not idle. The Hudson's Bay Company was founded in 1670, claiming vast territories around Hudson Bay. These regions, known as Rupert's Land, became another hub of the fur trade and competition. The English and French empires collided not just in Europe, but in the forests and rivers of North America. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, wars between Britain and France spilled into the colonies. Indigenous nations, seeking to protect their own interests, were drawn into these imperial rivalries. The Beaver Wars, the 7 Years' War, and countless smaller conflicts reshaped the map of North America. By 1763, after France's defeat in the 7 Years' War, the Treaty of Paris ceded most of its North American territories to Britain. New France became British Canada, and the French, speaking settlers, now subjects of the British Crown, faced an uncertain future. But Britain knew it needed to be cautious. To maintain peace, it issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763, recognizing indigenous land rights and setting rules for colonial expansion. It also allowed French Canadians to keep their language, religion, and civil law through the Quebec Act of 1774. These decisions, while pragmatic, planted the seeds of Canada's dual identity, English and French, Indigenous and European. When the American Revolution erupted in 1775, the shockwaves reached north. Many colonists loyal to Britain fled to Canada, settling in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Quebec, and Ontario. These Loyalists brought new energy, but also new tensions. English-speaking settlers wanted representative government, while the French Canadians sought to preserve their culture. In 1791, Britain divided the colony into Upper Canada, mostly English, and Lower Canada, mostly French. Each had its own legislature, but real power remained in the hands of colonial elites. Inequality and frustration grew, leading to the rebellions of 1837–38. Though these uprisings were quickly crushed, they forced Britain to reconsider its rule. Lord Durham's report recommended responsible government, a system where elected representatives, not appointed governors, would hold real authority. This idea would become a cornerstone of Canadian democracy. In 1841, Upper and Lower Canada were united into a single province of Canada, but deep divisions remained. English and French leaders learned, often painfully, the necessity of compromise. Meanwhile, other regions, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, watched from afar, each with its own ambitions and fears. By the mid-19th century, the pressures of expansion, trade, and defense made unity more attractive. The American Civil War and the threat of U.S. annexation pushed British North America to consider federation. In 1864, leaders from the colonies met in Charlottetown and Quebec to design a new nation built on partnership rather than conquest. On July 1, 1867, the Dominion of Canada was born, uniting Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick under a single federal system. John A. Macdonald became its first prime minister, but the new confederation was only the beginning. The dream of a coast-to-coast nation demanded expansion, and with it came conflict. The government purchased Rupert's Land from the Hudson's Bay Company in 1869, but Indigenous and Métis peoples who lived there were not consulted. The Métis, led by Louis Riel, rose in resistance at Red River, seeking recognition of their rights. The result was Manitoba's creation in 1870, but Riel's later rebellions and execution in 1885 would leave a lasting scar on the nation's conscience. The building of the Canadian Pacific Railway symbolized progress, a steel ribbon connecting east and west, but it came at a terrible cost. Thousands of Chinese laborers worked under brutal conditions, many losing their lives. Indigenous lands were taken, treaties broken, and communities displaced to make way for settlers and tracts. The expansion that fueled Canada's growth also deepened its moral debts. As immigration surged in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Canada became a mosaic of peoples: European settlers, Eastern Europeans, Chinese workers, and others seeking new lives. Yet this diversity was shadowed by discrimination. The Indian Act of 1876 imposed harsh control over Indigenous life. Residential schools tore children from their families in the name of assimilation, and non-European immigrants faced exclusion and prejudice. When the First World War broke out in 1914, Canada, still tied to Britain, entered automatically. Over 600,000 Canadians served, 60,000 died, The Battle of Vimy Ridge in 1917 became a defining moment, a victory that fostered a sense of independent national pride. Yet the war also deepened internal divisions, especially between English and French Canadians over conscription. The interwar years brought hardship. The Great Depression crushed economies and families. In the prairies, drought and dust storms turned farmland into wasteland. Out of suffering came new ideas: social welfare, labor rights, and political movements like the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, which would evolve into the new Democratic Party. Then came the Second World War. Canada declared war independently this time, a sign of its growing autonomy. Over 1 million Canadians served, many never returned. The war effort transformed industry, society, and the role of women, who entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. After 1945, Canada emerged not just as a colony, but as a confident nation on the world stage, helping to found the United Nations and later NATO. The post-war decades were years of growth. The baby boom, expanding cities, and new technologies reshaped daily life. Immigrants from Europe, Asia, and the Caribbean added new layers to Canada's identity. In 1965, the maple leaf flag was adopted, a symbol of unity and independence. 2 years later, Canada celebrated its centennial with optimism, though not all shared in the joy. In Quebec, a new generation demanded recognition of its language and culture. The quiet revolution of the 1960s transformed Quebec society, secularizing institutions and igniting a movement for sovereignty. Canada faced the challenge of remaining one nation, with 2 official languages and multiple identities. The October Crisis of 1970, when separatist extremists resorted to violence, tested the country's democracy and resolve. In 1982, Canada patriated its constitution from Britain, enshrining the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. For the first time, Canadians fully controlled their own laws, yet the process left Quebec feeling excluded, sparking decades of debate over unity. 2 referendums on independence in 1980 and 1995 narrowly preserved the Federation. As Canada moved into the 21st century, its identity continued to evolve. Multiculturalism became not just a policy, but a principle. Immigration transformed cities like Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal into global crossroads. At the same time, the country confronted the dark legacy of its past. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission exposed the horrors of residential schools, urging Canada to reckon with the pain of Indigenous peoples and commit to justice. Today, Canada stands as a nation of contrasts. Vast wilderness and modern cities, English and French, old wounds and new hopes. Its strength lies not in uniformity, but in diversity, its ability to hold many voices within a single conversation. The story of Canada is still being written. It is written in the melting ice of the Arctic, where climate change threatens ancient ways of life. It is written in the cities where newcomers build futures from distant dreams. It is written in every treaty being revisited, every language being revived, every act of remembrance and renewal. Canada's past was not perfect, far from it. It was built through struggle, compromise, and sometimes injustice. But it is also a story of resilience, of peoples who refused to disappear, of ideas that refuse to die, of a land that continues to teach humility and endurance. From the first footsteps on the tundra to the skyscrapers of modern Toronto, from the villages of the Pacific coast to the fishing towns of the Atlantic, the story of Canada is a reminder that history is not a line, it is a circle. Every generation returns to the same questions: who are we? Where do we belong? What kind of future will we build together? And so, as we look back across thousands of years, we see not just a country, but a conversation, a long and unfinished dialogue between land and people, between past and future. Canada endures because it listens, because it adapts, because it remembers. The story of Canada is not just about territory. It is a story of survival, coexistence, conflict, and identity woven across centuries of change. It is the tale of countless peoples who came before and those who came after, each leaving behind echoes that still shape the land today. From the snow-covered tundras of the north to the fertile plains of the prairies and the rugged coasts of the Atlantic and Pacific, Canada's history unfolds like a tapestry, its threads formed by struggle and resilience, its colors by culture and hope. It begins long before maps, before borders, before nations. For thousands of years, Indigenous peoples lived upon these lands, guided by deep knowledge of the earth, the seasons, and the spirits that bound all living things together. Their societies were rich and complex, built on respect for balance, cooperation, and stewardship. They did not see the land as something to be owned, but as something to be cared for, shared, and passed on. This was the first and most enduring relationship with the land we now call Canada, one of harmony, not conquest. Then came the strangers sailing across oceans in fragile wooden ships, drawn by curiosity, greed, and the promise of new worlds. The arrival of Europeans would forever change the destiny of this continent. What began as exploration soon became colonization. Yet even in the face of upheaval, Canada's story was never a simple clash between two worlds. It was an evolving encounter between many worlds. Survival became the first chapter of this encounter. The newcomers could not have endured without the guidance of Indigenous peoples who taught them how to live through harsh winters, navigate vast rivers, and understand the rhythms of a new and forgiving environment. Coexistence followed, though it was fragile. Trade, especially in furs, connected communities and cultures, but it also introduced new rivalries, new dependencies, and new diseases that brought tragedy to Indigenous nations. Conflict, too, was ever present between empires, between settlers, between those who sought to rule and those who sought to remain free. The struggle for dominance between France and Britain, the resistance of the Métis and First Nations against expansion, the tensions between English and French, all became defining tests of what this land could endure. Every victory came with loss. Every step forward left someone behind. Yet through every age of conflict there was also creation. New languages took root, new ideas emerged, and new identities began to form. Canada became a land of contradictions, founded in conquest, but striving for peace, divided by culture, but united by necessity, scarred by injustice, but still capable of compassion. This is why Canada's history cannot be told as a simple tale of nation, building, or empire. It is the story of people, of those who fought, negotiated, and dreamed their way towards something greater than survival. It is a reminder that identity is not given. It is built, piece by piece, through courage, reconciliation, and understanding. To speak of Canada, then, is to speak of endurance, the endurance of Indigenous nations who preserved their traditions despite oppression, the endurance of settlers who braved the unknown, the endurance of communities who refused to let language or faith be erased. Each century added another layer to the national soul, a soul defined not by perfection, but by persistence. So when we look at Canada today, we do not see merely lines on a map or provinces on a page. We see a living legacy of coexistence, one that continues to evolve. Canada's story is still being written, shaped by its people's determination to learn from the past, while reaching toward a more inclusive and honest future. Because in the end, the history of Canada is not about what was taken or claimed. It is about what was shared, what was learned, and what continues to bind us together through time. The enduring human spirit, the courage to begin again, and the belief that even in the coldest of lands, hope can always take root. Canada's evolution from Indigenous homelands to a colonial battleground, and finally to a modern nation, reflects the broader human journey from division toward unity. It is a story that mirrors the struggles of all humanity, a journey from separation to understanding, from conflict to cooperation, from the chaos of conquest to the possibility of coexistence. Long before the flags of Europe were raised upon its soil, this land was already home to countless nations, each with its own government, language, and vision of the world. The indigenous peoples of Canada had built societies grounded in respect, reciprocity, and balance. They did not draw borders upon the earth, for the land was sacred, shared among all who depended on it. Every river, mountain, and forest had a spirit, a purpose, a place in the circle of life. Their civilizations thrived not through domination, but through harmony. Then came the arrival of colonizers' men carrying the banners of France and Britain, guided by ambition, faith, and empire. To them, this vast continent seemed empty, waiting to be claimed. But in truth, it was already full of life, of stories, of people who had lived here since time immemorial. What followed was not discovery, but encounter, one world meeting another, neither fully understanding the other's ways. The first exchanges were marked by curiosity and necessity. The indigenous peoples helped the newcomers survive, teaching them how to fish, hunt, and endure the winters. Trade flourished, bringing together furs and metals, languages and customs. But beneath this fragile cooperation lay a deeper tension, an imbalance of power that would grow into centuries of struggle. As the colonies expanded, the land became a battleground not only for survival, but for control. France and Britain fought to claim the heart of North America, their conflicts reaching from European courts to the frozen rivers of Quebec and the plains of Ontario. The 7 Years' War, known in Canada as the struggle for empire, left the French defeated and the British triumphant. Yet even in victory, Britain inherited a complex challenge: how to rule a land filled with peoples of different faiths, languages, and loyalties. The new British Canada was a mosaic of contradictions. French settlers sought to preserve their culture and religion. Indigenous nations fought to defend their autonomy, and waves of newcomers, Loyalists fleeing the American Revolution, farmers seeking land, and immigrants seeking hope, arrived to shape a new society. Conflict remained, but so did the growing realization that coexistence was not only possible, but necessary. Through rebellion, reform, and compromise, Canada slowly began to define itself not as a conquered territory, but as a community bound by shared purpose. Confederation in 1867 was not the birth of a nation in the sudden sense, but rather a step toward unity through diversity. It brought together provinces and peoples who were different in language and belief, yet united by the desire to govern themselves peacefully. Still, the path toward unity was not without pain. The displacement of indigenous peoples, the betrayal of promises, and the injustices of colonization remained deep wounds. The Métis uprisings, the signing and breaking of treaties, and the establishment of residential schools revealed the darker side of Canada's evolution, a reminder that progress can never erase the past, only confront it, and yet, even amid the divisions, a spirit of resilience endured. Canada learned, through trial and error, that true strength lies not in uniformity but in diversity. Its story became a reflection of humanity's greatest struggle: how to reconcile differences without destroying them, how to build peace without silencing truth. In the 20th century, that idea matured. From the battlefields of Europe, where Canadians fought not for conquest but for freedom, to the halls of diplomacy where peacekeeping became a national calling, Canada began to embody the hope that nations could rise above rivalry. The country embraced multiculturalism, recognizing that identity could expand, not contract, that unity could coexist with difference. Today, Canada's journey continues. It stands as a nation still reckoning with its history, still healing old wounds, still striving to balance the many voices that form its chorus. The road from division to unity is never finished. It is walked every day, through reconciliation, through justice, through understanding. Canada's transformation, from the sacred lands of its first peoples, through the fires of colonization, to the open dialogue of modern democracy, reflects not just a national story, but a human one. It is a reminder that even in the face of conflict, cooperation can prevail, that from division we can forge unity, and that every nation, like every person, must choose between repeating the past or redefining it. And so, the story of Canada is not just about where it has been, but where it is going, a living testament that the journey toward unity, though difficult, is always worth the struggle. The history of Canada teaches that peace, though fragile, is possible when understanding replaces conquest and cooperation becomes the foundation of progress. It reminds us that true strength does not come from the domination of others, but from the courage to listen, to reconcile, and to build bridges where once there were walls. Canada's story, through its triumphs and its tragedies, stands as living proof that even the deepest divisions can give way to unity when people choose dialogue over violence and compassion over pride. From the very beginning, peace in this land was never a given. It had to be earned, protected, and renewed with every generation. When the first Europeans arrived, they entered a world already shaped by the laws, alliances, and wisdom of indigenous nations. These first relationships were not always easy, but they began with necessity and at times mutual respect. The fur trade was more than an exchange of goods, it was an exchange of trust. Indigenous guides showed explorers how to survive the winters, navigate vast wilderness, and understand the balance of the natural world. Without cooperation, the newcomers would not have endured, but as empires grew, so did greed. The balance shifted from partnership to possession, from respect to control. Wars erupted between the French and the British, between settlers and indigenous peoples, between neighbors divided by language and faith. And yet, even amid the battles, moments of understanding endured. The Great Peace of Montreal in 1701, signed between New France and over 30 indigenous nations, was one of the earliest and most remarkable examples of diplomacy on this continent. It showed that peace could be achieved not through conquest, but through conversation, through recognizing the humanity on the other side of the table. When the colonies became a nation in 1867, the dream of peace was written into its foundation. Confederation was not born from a revolution, but from negotiation. Leaders from different provinces, religions, and languages sat together to build something larger than themselves, a country built on compromise. It was not perfect and it did not include everyone, but it was a beginning. Still, peace in Canada has always been imperfect, always incomplete. For the indigenous peoples, the treaties signed with the Crown often became tools of betrayal rather than partnership. Lands were taken, children were stolen into residential schools, cultures were silenced under the weight of assimilation. For generations, the promise of peace was broken again and again. But even in that pain, the spirit of understanding did not vanish. It endured in the songs, languages, and resilience of indigenous communities who refused to let their stories be erased. In time, Canada began to awaken to its own conscience. The 20th century brought moments of reflection and redemption. From the aftermath of 2 world wars, Canadians learned that peace could not be passive. It required active commitment, both at home and abroad. Canada became a peacekeeping nation, sending soldiers not to conquer, but to protect, to mediate, to heal. It was a role born not of perfection, but of empathy, a recognition that peace, once lost, is costly to regain. At home, the same principle began to take root. The quiet revolution in Quebec, the Indigenous rights movements, the fight for bilingualism and multiculturalism. All of these were struggles to be heard, not to dominate. Each was a step toward a broader understanding that peace is not the absence of difference. It is the acceptance of it. In recent decades, Canada's history has demanded an even deeper kind of peace: reconciliation. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission laid bare the horrors of the past, forcing the nation to confront what it had tried to forget. The road toward healing remains long, but it is being walked with humility, with dialogue, with the understanding that peace cannot exist without justice. And so, Canada's story teaches us a simple but powerful truth. Peace is not found in treaties alone, nor in flags or borders, but in the daily acts of respect between people. It lives in the classrooms where Indigenous languages are spoken again, in the communities where newcomers are welcomed, in the hearts of those who choose empathy over indifference. Peace is fragile because it depends on us, on our choices, our courage, our willingness to understand one another. But it is also enduring because it is renewed every time people come together to listen, to forgive, and to rebuild. The history of Canada reminds us that cooperation is not a sign of weakness. It is the foundation of progress. Every great achievement in this nation's story, from Confederation to peacekeeping, from reconciliation to multiculturalism, has been built not by force, but by unity. So, as we look to the future, let us remember that peace is never finished. It is a living promise, written not in stone, but in the hearts of those who continue to believe in it. And if the story of Canada teaches us anything, it is that even in a world divided by difference, peace remains possible when we choose to understand before we seek to be understood, when we replace conquest with compassion, and build our future upon cooperation rather than conflict.